I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.
Take 5 for the beginning of this podcast.
They don't always go your way.
No, they don't.
So today we're looking at a Dumu poem. That's Dumu of the late Tang, not Dufu of the mid Tang.
Right.
This particular poem we chose because a friend of ours, Catherine, who's a faithful and loyal listener of the podcast, her son's Chinese name is actually drawn from some of the characters in one of the lines of this poem. Rob, what did you think of this poem?
Yeah, I was going to say, you and I, although certainly we are so brilliant and widely read in the entire Chinese tradition. Right. Now, neither of us had read Dumu before coming at this, right? I think you'd mentioned him, and I was like, oh, I know Du Fu, but not Dumu.
Yeah. So just to catch the listener who's maybe as uneducated about late Tang poetry as Rob and I are to catch you up. So Dumu is one of the top 3 poets of the late Tang. Now, you'll remember from some of our earlier podcasts that the Tang dynasty really has 3 greats.
Yep.
That's, Rob, help me out here.
Li Bai, Du Fu, and Wang Wei.
Right. Those guys all kind of were circulating around the same time. This is the mid-Tang. This is the period before the Anlushan Rebellion. Those are the big names. When you study Tang poetry, like when kids memorize poems in elementary school in China,
This is it.
that's them. Dumu is actually part of another triple alliance. I don't know how to say it.
Right.
Trilogy,
Yeah.
Trinity, something.
The second Star Wars trilogy. Not as good as the first, but not bad.
Yeah. So there's Dumu, there's Li Shangyin, who we've done a podcast on.
Yeah.
And then there's Wen Tingyun. So we've done a podcast on Li Shangyin. This is our first one on Dumu. Dumu has a bit of a reputation as kind of a ladies' man.
Or a flaneur, as the French would say. Sort of a man about town,
Yeah, he's
a wanderer.
He drinks a little bit too much. In his kind of poetic
Right.
persona.
And we should point out that this was a cultivated persona. It wasn't like he just happened to be a hard-drinking guy who wrote poetry. He made sure that people knew he was a hard-drinking guy who wrote poetry.
Absolutely. I think that's an important point. Though, to be fair, Dumu probably did drink a lot, but
Sure.
maybe not any more than anybody who was a poet during this time. I mean, to be a civil servant, to be someone important in Tang China, you had to do 2 things: write poetry and be able to get drunk.
There it is. That's to some extent that's still true. Certainly, if you're moving in governmental circles in China now or business circles, and you can quote Du Fu and Li Bai and drink a lot, you're going to go pretty far, right?
But how much better is it to actually quote Dumu,
True.
who no one is expecting anyone to memorize?
Of course, the fact that no one's expecting it probably means they don't know who you're quoting. So they're like, "What are you talking about?" There's not a lot of street cred there, but
There's
I should also
so much
mention,
street cred.
because actually, I've done that before, though. I've tried to talk about poetry and stuff that a lot of people around me didn't know about at a university. And people are just like, why are we talking about this? No one writes about this or talks about this. And I remember thinking, shouldn't that be why we do that? Anyway, strange times. So one other thing I should mention, though, before we talk a little more specifically about the poem, is that the late Tang sort of traditionally is seen as this is when the flame is sort of burning out, right? And so there's a little more experimentation in the late Tang. And this is going to come into play in a second with Dumu, but a lot of the poetic forms that the Song dynasty is known for. The Song is sort of known for a kind of freewheeling, just throw it on the wall and see what sticks kind of poetry. Go ahead.
To put some names or some terminology to that, so in Tang you have poetry, which is called shi. In the Song you have ci. Now the difference between these, it's kind of
arbitrary sometimes.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, ci is specifically associated with the Song dynasty.
Yes.
And shi is associated both with the Tang, but it also kind of refers to poetry in general.
Right.
I think sometimes this is translated as shi is poem, whereas ci is
Song,
lyric
yeah.
or song.
Mm-hmm.
But really, these are just two very different styles.
The
of poetry.
important thing, though, the important thing to bear in mind, and then we'll jump into Dumu because this will sort of lead into that, is that the reason Shi is called poetry is because by this point it has been fairly codified. This is what makes a poem within these boundaries. It has to be within these boundaries, and you can't sing a song with it. It's not meant to be sung in drinking parlors. It's a poem to be read and studied and, whatever, appreciated. Fine wine. It's not Budweiser or something. But once you get into the late Tang and then into the Song de Ci, is people going, why not write a song? Why not take a song lyric and just throw it out there and see what you can do with it, right? Now, that's kind of one of the things the late Tang is known for. Now, the reason I bring it up here is because that's not what Dumu's doing. The poem that we're talking about is, I think, a very beautiful poem. It's a very poignant poem. The gist of the narrative.
Sorry, the name of the poem, Rob. We haven't actually said the name of the poem.
Yes, the name of the poem is Dumu Zhang Hao Hao Shi. So it is a shi. It is a poem with quotation marks around it.
So I think normally it would just be like Zhang Hao Hao is the name of the woman who Dumu is writing about. So
Right.
I think we probably just refer to it as Zhang Hao Hao Shi, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Hao Hao is just
That's
Ni Hao.
Yeah,
the
Ni Hao, like her. Yeah.
So this is a very weird name. First off,
Well, and so here's why the poem is interesting. First off, you have a subject that is on the surface fairly ribald, right? It's a sort of an elegy of sorts for a what would you call her? Not really a courtesan, I guess, sort of.
singer. So just to give the basic outlines of the poem, Dumu meets this girl when she's just 13. And it's not really clear what kind of relationship they had. But then he runs into her many years after that. And she is a singer. She's kind of been working in the red light district. Keep in mind, in the Tang Dynasty, there's not really all that much difference between working as a singer and working in sex work. So she is a singer, but that may imply
That she has other
things.
talents, yeah.
But it may not. It's just really unclear.
It's fairly ambiguous, yeah.
And one of the things that happens is he is looking at her as she's going from transitioning from being a beautiful woman to being an older woman who can't keep up
Right.
with this, and he's thinking about his past memories. And that's really, this is a very long poem. It's probably like 60, 70 lines
Right.
long. But that's really the plot. He meets this woman, Zhang Hao Hao, when she's kind of transitioning out of her old profession. She's losing her beauty. She's still beautiful, but he's remembering when she was kind of a budding woman.
And the poem is intentionally, I would argue, vague about how her life has been since then. He sort of posits that, maybe it's been good. She seems to be in good form. Her voice is still strong and all that. Why does he remember her when she's younger? Could just be it happens to be what he remembers. It could be to compare her unflatteringly to the person she used to be. But it's not clear. And the unclearness is part of what makes this style of poetry what it is, right?
I like that, Rob. The ambiguity in this poem is very important. And one of the things, so we're taking the translation that we're using. It's far too long for us to translate, but just as a reference, we're looking at Stephen Owen's book, Late Tang. And he mentions that there's this question that kind of hangs over this poem and all of poetry in the Tang. Like, we're reading this now and we're trying to think this is written for our sake about this woman. But the question is, and this gets at that ambiguity, a lot of the poem is not actually about anything that happens. It kind of skates around what their relationship originally was, what she's been doing. But how much of this poetry is actually written to be a public poem?
Right.
How much of it is actually just a private thing that we are reading more than a millennium later?
And a lot of these more refined, I'm going to use the word refined, poetic styles in the mid-Tang especially, which, like you mentioned, this style he's using is a mid-Tang style. You wouldn't use it if you were going to use it to reflect, because Bai Juyi, the Tang poet, also has a similar poem, remembering, the Song of the Peepaw is the name of the poem, remembering a woman in her youth, etc. There's more detail in this one. There's more pathos in this one. It's more specific, and the specificity is important too, because once you start getting into the song, it's way more specific, more ribald. It's cruder.
It's not. It's the song Tzu is not always cruder.
No.
We should point that out.
No, but it's capable of doing so. You would not write a proper poem using scatological language and prostitutes and things like that.
And Li Shangyin is about as dirty as you get in Tang Shi.
And to point out, that is late Tang.
Yeah, that is late Tang as it's transitioning into the song. And also, I mean, it's, like things that were risque in the late Tang may leave the modern reader kind of questioning
That's what you think is risque? Jeez. No, but the reason I bring all that up is because you have subject matter that a poet writing, say, a generation or so later, might really turn into something funny, gross. I mean, there's a lot of stuff you could do. There's more latitude for this kind of subject in the song. Dumu turns it into a very dignified, beautifully rendered classic poem, right? It would be like if you have a couple of styles and then you are of poetry now, and you're choosing to remember this woman that you once had interesting feelings for and you see again after many years, but using like properly rhymed quatrains. It would be peculiar, but in some ways, once you get past that, you would think, wow, that says something about his feelings, that he would choose to preserve this in a proper poem,
I just want to read a couple of lines from the actual poem.
Do it.
So this is from Stephen Owen's translation in, again, late Tang. This is the final 4 lines. The sinking sun hangs in dying willows, and chill winds rise at the edge of my seat. I have shed all the tears that soak my lapels, and now write this short song. This is him as he's seeing Zhang Haohao.
Yeah.
Kind of like separating from her for one more time after having run into her again. Mm-hmm. So you're right. There is a lot of pathos in this poem.
And you and I can't speculate offhand the reasons behind, say, naming someone after a line from this poem, because I don't remember which line they chose, but it's still, I can see it in the sense that this is a reflection on what time is, what time does to people, and it's ambiguous. This isn't a hooray, hooray, everything is going to be great. It's very sad in places, but it's also very not happy so much, but joyful perhaps. Like,
it's kind of realistic joy.
It's a realistic joy, remembering someone's youth as something beautiful, not necessarily as something wasted or old. This is the thing, is that we don't have any lines in here saying something like, "Oh, geez, she really has not turned out. She has not aged well." Like, you don't get anything like that,
Yeah, it's almost this kind of philosophical meditation on age, and life in general, I would say, and it's I think a very thoughtful choice in terms of like picking out good poetic names.
Yeah. And there's one line in particular, I want to bring this in too, because you mentioned a couple of lines. Shortly before the ones you quoted, he runs into her in Luoyang and says, "You marvel at what has caused me such grief, that in youth my beard hangs white. Are your companions surviving or not? Can you still be as unrestrained as you were? After we wept in grief at the lodge's gate, waters and clouds showed autumn's onset." Now, it's interesting because those are sad lines, but they're not necessarily bleak lines, I have to imagine they look back on youth the way most people do. Like, wow, you remember that? I guess we're not really those people anymore, are we? And that's, again, this is such a beautiful poem because he intentionally steers clear of that obviously sort of pathetic response. I use that not in a negative term, but full of pathos, emotion response. Because youth does go away, And he weeps, but even at the end, I have shed all the tears that soak my lapels, and now write this short song.
And it's this meditation on Zhang Hao Hao and how she has gone from being an entertainer, she's become a concubine for the Shen Shushi. And this kind of change in status that comes with it, thinking about how it's almost like, I mean, there are these seasonal references in the poem. I think autumn is referenced, which autumn is always a kind of reminder winter is coming.
Right. But and this is why I think in some ways this kind of poetry is so affecting, because the style of poetry itself is so beautifully rendered that it colors how you experience these emotions. If it was meant to be purely a song lyric, it might be a little more vernacular, a little more weathered, you know. This is intentionally at a distance from the reader. You feel some of the emotions, but you're not meant to feel them all. This is not a poem for everyone. And I think that's part of the appeal, because there's lots of ways to access this. You can sit and think about it and go, wow, am I supposed to be sad or not? Well, that's, you know, are you supposed to be sad or not that you're getting older? You know, like it really, I mean, some days yes, some days no. The fact that he's writing this, the fact that he's able to write something this beautiful is a part of his having gotten older, you know, being able to look back and have the experiences, the literary and life experiences to work with.
Can I ask, Rob, is there any sense of maturation in this poem? Is it, because I was actually reading, it sounds like you're saying it's not clear if someone's supposed to be sad in this poem about growing old. I was reading it as a mostly sad poem, but it sounds like you're saying it's not actually a sad. Rob, what do you think?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I don't know that I'd say it's not sad, but this subject could be rendered in far sadder terms. We could have meditations on, man, things have just gotten rough. It's so clear, you know. Instead, you have a lot of reflection on how things were. You have one moment where they're sort of crying together, and it's more wistful than it is sad, I would say. I don't read sort of deeply tragic, pathetic emotion.
I don't think I would say deeply tragic or pathetic, but just this meditation on how things used to be, to me, evokes this implicit kind of sadness.
But I would, you know, my point is not that it's not sad. It's not that it's not sad.
How many nots?
I don't know. I could throw a lot in there and see if
quadruple negative.
That's it. See if they can follow us. What's he saying? We're going to be ambiguous. That'll up our numbers.
Yeah.
But so much that it's when I read this, I do not come away from this poem going, man, that was sad. It's more like, that was. I can see the sadness of the characters, but they're at a distance from me. It's like I'm watching them through the window of a bar. Like I can see what's going on, but I'm not a part of it. And in some ways, I think that's intentional with the form of the poem and the way it's executed. So it's an interesting way to go about it.
I think that's a great place to leave it, Rob.
All right.
Well, dedicated again to Catherine and her son. Merry Christmas. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.